I'm here.
This is Sarah. We just unmuted, and we've got the state board team and Michael Durline here. And Amy's been kind of keeping tabs, I think, on which of our members have dialed in. You've got, is Mike on the line as well?
Yes.
I'm here.
So we have Mike Edwards, we have Bob Beebe, but Daryl, did you all see Daryl is not able to join us?
I saw his email, yep. I'm sorry we're missing him.
Okay.
On the
Well,
line as well?
I'm sorry, who is that?
Bob is on the line as well?
Yes, he is.
Yes.
Well, let's go ahead and get started. It is 9 a.m. I want to start out by welcoming everyone, and pleased that Bob and Mike Edwards could be with us today. Unfortunately, we'll miss Daryl, but he will catch up, and I think he's going to follow up with you, Amy, to make sure he's up to speed. I do want to also start out by welcoming Dr. Sarah Morrison back from her leave of absence after giving birth to her son, her first child, Roscoe. So, Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you're going to take us just through an outline of the agenda, and then we'll get started because we have a lot to cover.
Great. That sounds fantastic. Thanks, Lillian. And yes, it's good to be back. I'm highly caffeinated these days, as I tell people, so probably talking faster than usual, but it's been a great few months, and it's been also really good to get back with the team and dig back into our work. So excited to be with you this morning. We've got a pretty full agenda. It's posted on our website, and I know the members have it via email, but we're going to cover a number of topics on today's call, starting with some updates from our team at the State Board on the teacher preparation report card. As you know, we'll be producing that as we do annually, and that'll be coming out early in 2019. Michael Durline with the Department of Education is here with us this morning, and we're going to hear from Michael some updates related to the annual report, which is, again, a corollary report, as you all know, that gets produced annually as well on teacher prep programs across our state. And then Michael's also going to talk a little bit about permits, waivers, and other sort of flexibility options that districts have in terms of staffing. I know that was a topic that came up at the October meeting, which I missed, obviously, but have connected with the various ones of you about the follow-up conversation that we'll have today related to that October conversation. And then finally, Dr. Matt Ronfelt from the University of Michigan is kind enough to join us this morning. He's going to be presenting some research that he's been doing in collaboration with the department on clinical mentoring and thinking about, again, the student-teacher component of our teacher prep programs and what we can learn about what really works and what seems to be most effective in terms of that really important mentor relationship that student teachers have as part of their teacher prep program experience. So we're going to try to do all that in 2 hours, which means I'm going to stop talking just about now unless anybody has questions and turn it over to the State Board team to jump into the teacher prep report card updates.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks Lillian, Bob, and Mike for joining us this morning. This is Amy Owen, Director of Policy and Research with the State Board. I'm pleased to be talking with y'all this morning. We're going to start out, like Sarah said, with looking at some updates on the 2018 Teacher Prep Report Card. As you know, the board produces this report card annually with the input of an advisory council. Our advisory council is critical to the decisions that we make here. And we're going to walk through our decisions on 2018 report card enhancements, as well as things that we'll consider for a larger design refresh in 2019. So feel free to stop me as I go if you have any questions. But we're looking forward to producing this report card, and we think that we've got a lot of strong recommendations from our advisory council. Our advisory council was comprised of folks from 5 different educator prep programs, as well as from representatives of school districts, advocacy groups. Bob was our state board representative, and then, of course, the state board, department, and Tennessee higher education staff. I'd like to pause right here. This is one of, I don't think in prior years we'd had a board member on this advisory council actively, maybe just not last year.
Yeah, in the past it's been a little bit hit or miss, but we've attempted to do that. Bob has been a very loyal member and attended all the meetings thus far.
So I'd love, Bob, if you don't mind, if you have a second to just describe for the rest of the members what the advisory council was like, your main takeaways, how you found the discussion.
Sure. Well, you know, like Amy says, you can see the makeup of it, but I will say this, is that I didn't know what to think with regard to how people would feel about the educator prep report card. And what I found is that all the representative colleges and universities pretty much unanimously support the report card and the activities that we're doing. They just want to be sure that we get a good representation And it's a very frank, very open discussion, very good comments, but in general, I think most of the people are pretty consistent about what they're looking for and seeing the value of it.
Great. Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate that. And feel free, as we go through, to chime in with things that you heard or different points of discussion. So I'll start off. I know this is a lot of text on this page. You have this presentation. It's on our website, and we've also created a one-pager with this information that we're going to share with EdPrep programs later this week. We have a list of enhancements for 2018, and then, like I said, some potential changes for the 2019 design refresh. I'm not going to go into a ton of depth here. I'll say that some of the most intense discussion was around what that landing page should look like. And one thing that we heard loud and clear from programs is that they wanted to make sure that this was not presented as the be-all, end-all, everything possible about their program, but as a way to monitor how they're doing on some key policy levers for the state board. And I think that's a fair point. Programs are complex. They have many different things going on, and we have certain priorities as a state that we're tracking. So what we're doing is reframing some of the language on the landing page to indicate that the report is about how programs are performing on some of our key priority areas. We also plan to move the overall score, that 1 through 4 summative score, to the far right column on the report card landing page. It's currently the first column, and what programs suggested is that if it were all the way over, it would give a better visual cue to folks that that summative score is the result of their scores in the 3 preceding domains, basically like adding it up. For the admissions section, or the admissions assessment, we are going to expand that. Currently, it only looks at the percentage of completers who enter a program with an acceptable score on the ACT or SAT. What our programs told us, which is a fair point, is that by policy, people who pass all 3 components of the Praxis Core assessment are also admitted in a traditional fashion. The only folks who would not be included here are those who are admitted on appeal. So maybe they passed 1 or 2 parts of the Praxis Core, but not all 3, or the program admitted them for some other extenuating circumstance.
Amy?
Yes, sir.
Are we still using Praxis for content knowledge?
For the Praxis Core here, this is the initial assessment when you're coming into a program to indicate that you have a strong base level of reading, writing, math knowledge. There's another set of exams when you finish the program that's about your pedagogy and content knowledge in your specific area.
And Mike, those Praxis 2, those are the ones we've been looking at to make sure they're aligned with our student academic standards, the Praxis 2. That's it.
And how long we've been looking at that?
Well, it seems like we've been doing reviews of various of those Praxis 2 assessments for at least the last 2 years. We started talking about it probably slightly prior to that, but the last year and a half to 2 years. And
Mike, we've made some changes. We updated some of the assessments for middle and secondary math. We've updated the elementary assessment from being just one comprehensive one to having subject-specific sub-scores. We've been making changes as we go and as we review the different areas.
All right. I'll ask again, but yeah, go.
Good deal. Employment is another area where we're going to have some changes. We are providing a space on that page for providers to give a short statement about common options their graduates do after leaving school, especially for those programs that are not preparing folks to go into Tennessee public school classrooms as much. For example, if it's a religious college or if it's maybe on the border and they know a lot of their folks go to a different state. We've been getting those statements. Catherine's been collecting them from EdPrep programs for the last couple weeks. And what programs really made the point about, which I think is fair, due to our data limitations, we're not able to capture employment data really well beyond who's in a Tennessee public school classroom. And, people go do many things after school. They can go teach in a Tennessee public school, a private school, another state, go to grad school. And folks were getting sticker shock when they looked at the report card and said, oh my goodness, what do you mean only 40% of your completers are employed? And it's not that that's the only people who are employed, it's those are the only folks who are employed who we can track. So this is going to give providers the option to provide more context. And I think that will actually be really helpful for folks who are looking at where they want to go to school. If I know going in, I want to go teach at a Catholic school, and I see that that program's mission is to prepare me to do so, that's really useful information for me. So that's going to be one change we see on the employment metric.
And Amy, I want to pause there for a second. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we had a lengthy discussion about that, and I think there is a lot of concern that we're not able to track those that go out of state and teach out of the state. So it was a pretty big fraction of the students who graduate who go out of state who the ed prep providers weren't getting credit for. So this is good.
Yeah, and Bob, this is Sarah. I was just going to make that same point that, while these seem like subtle changes, and they're important changes, I think, to reflect a lot of the feedback that we've gotten from our providers, which is, like Amy said, really fair and legitimate in that, our limitations with the data mean that we can only track Tennessee public schools, students who are teaching in Tennessee public schools, and we know that students graduate from programs and are successful in a lot of other placements. I think the other thing to keep in mind, too, and this is why we've rephrased that landing page to say sort of state priorities, is that obviously we have an interest in making sure, as the State Board of Education, that we've got really strong teachers going into our public schools. So making clear that this is employment in Tennessee public schools, and then allowing providers to really narrate a little bit about their program and their candidates and the types of employment that they experience post-graduation, especially if that is something that's different than a Tennessee public school, feels important. So didn't want to gloss over that, because I think this is one of the areas we've gotten the most feedback from our providers asking us to try to make some changes. And we've explored, obviously, ways of capturing data for placement in other settings beyond the public school setting, but it's really challenging to do that in a way that's consistent across programs and doesn't add additional burden to, especially small programs who have more challenges tracking their students. So any other comments on that?
Here's something that, to me, what we're wanting to know is how well these EEPs have prepared their students to teach. If a teacher, for whatever reason, decides to go to law school, decides to open up a florist or whatever, that really doesn't inform us how well that EEP did in preparing that person to teach, because people do leave for all sorts of reasons, and not just to go teach elsewhere outside the state or whatever. I'd much rather know why they were dismissed than know if they're not teaching in the fourth year or third year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I hear you saying is, again, we would want to capture an additional data point potentially if we were able, in terms of candidates who do not finish the program. Is that what you're saying, Mike?
No. What I'm saying is, if what we want to know is at the end of the third year, how, after the end of the first year, the second year, the third year, how are those former students of that EEP performing? That's really the telltale sign. And a lot of these people aren't teaching after 1, 2, or 3 years, but it doesn't necessarily reflect on whether or not they were trained well or not.
No, Mike, I definitely know we've had this discussion before, and at our level, we don't have access to district HR data for something like an exit interview to say, Michael left because he went to law school. We did not renew Elizabeth because she was ineffective, something like that. So we don't have that kind of information. The only thing we would have would be if somebody had a serious licensure discipline issue, that we would know that that's why that person was not renewed.
But see, even that would be a morals issue possibly, but not necessarily how academically that EEP performed in preparing that student to teach. I'm just wanting to make sure we don't make too many broad assumptions based on pretty subjective reports.
And this is Lillian. There are so many other factors that would cause somebody to leave, and not knowing what that is should not reflect negatively on the EPP. Sometimes it could be the fact that they were not getting enough coaching and mentoring, because that first couple of years is critical when they get into the classroom. What kind of feedback are they getting? What kind of coaching and mentoring are they getting when they're in the classroom? So sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's leadership. It's a variety of reasons that may cause someone, and it could be simply that they discovered, I'm not really cut out for this. I thought I wanted to be in the classroom with 14-year-olds or 8-year-olds. That's not really who I am. I discovered it way too late, and I know people who've done that, who've been on that road and left because of that, or they moved to another state, or a variety of other reasons. So I think we want it to be reflective, but not negatively toward the EPP when there are factors that are not within their control.
I think that's a fair point. I would also suggest that those factors, we don't have any reason to necessarily think they affect one of our programs more than the other. And we are required to report on employment and retention. So I think it's a valuable point to say that we want to work with our programs going into next year to think about ways we can gather information about completers who are working outside Tennessee public schools or who choose to pursue some kind of alternative career path. I think that the more data we have, the more information, the better. And that can only help our programs, too, in terms of thinking about the ongoing support and guidance and counseling they're providing to folks to maybe get them to have that moment a little earlier of like, oh no, I need to do something different with my career path, or I really love teaching, but I want a different grade level. So I see what y'all are saying, that there are so many factors here that will be down to specific individuals. But this is like the farthest we could try to go this year to capture more information and while still meeting our legislative charge.
Okay. We made our point.
Make as many points as you want, Mike. I'll move on to the next slide if y'all are good. Like I said, I'm not going to go word through word on this because I know you have this in hand and it's just a lot of text on this screen. Provider impact was another area that had a lot of discussion this year. As you know, we had some assessment challenges in 2017-18, and our providers were very concerned with, what happened if one of my completers' classrooms experienced some kind of testing issue? Am I going to be, negatively affected in some way from that? So what we came to is we are working really closely with the Department of Ed to use the exact same business rules they're using on the annual reports, where if a teacher chose to nullify or not count his or her 17-18 assessment results due to some kind of irregularity, that person will not have a negative impact on their provider. It will be as if that year of testing just didn't happen for them. They're not going to be counted for or against the provider if they chose to nullify. We're still working on the exact number of completers that affects per program, but we're going to make sure we're exactly in sync with the department and that we honor those teachers' decisions. I think that I'm hoping that's something our providers can feel good about, knowing that you've trained these completers. They are the ones who are on the ground, who knew what was happening in their classrooms during the assessment cycle, who will be able to make the best possible decisions about using their assessment results. In addition, we are going to provide links to the legislation regarding student assessment from 2017-18 and to an external report the Department of Education commissioned from some really well thought of data and statistics experts to look at the validity and reliability of the 2017-18 assessment results. So that way, consumers who are looking at this information will have everything at their disposal. They'll know what the legislation was, what the external report said, and will indicate that we held programs, not accountable for anybody who chose to nullify their score. Finally, at the request of several of our programs, we are adding a metric that will be unscored this year on overall level of effectiveness. That's a teacher's summative evaluation score that includes TVOS, it includes their observation scores, and a 15% achievement measure that they can select. What the programs suggested was that this is a number that's really important to their completers. It's something that factors into, retention or bonus decisions for them, so they would like to see that number reflected somewhere on the report card. we had a long discussion with the advisory council about whether to score it, how to compare it to the TVOS and observation metrics. One thing that I know Catherine and I are concerned about from the data perspective is that LOE is by nature a multiple measure. So whether it's good or bad, you don't know what's driving that score. Is it that the person had a high observation and a low TVOS, or vice versa? Or were they about the same? So we definitely want to continue reporting those metrics separately, but we're up for a discussion for 2019 on how to consider including LOE. So do y'all want to talk about that? I'm sure that's something you've heard a good bit about from your constituents. Or Bob, do you want to reflect at all on how that conversation went?
Yeah, I was just going to say is that that was one also of a lengthy conversation, and I think again people recognize the value. The question is how do you do it and get mold it down to just one number or one criteria, and so I think they having the things delineated what makes up is important, so that if there is a kind of an outlier, people can understand why that outlier is there. But again, I think the prep providers were very supportive of having some kind of a overall effectiveness measurement to see how the teachers were performing.
Other thoughts or comments on that?
I'm just curious because I think you said it would be challenging to obtain that summative score because of the various components and not having access to knowing if there was a lower TVOS and a higher observation and what 15% achievement measure did the teacher select. Is there any way to get that? And it sounds like there's not.
No. We do have that exact information.
We do? Okay, I misunderstood. Okay.
No, sorry, I was probably talking too quickly. If all you include is the overall level of effectiveness, like that's the only thing you're given, then somebody who just sees that doesn't know what's driving that score. Is it that the TVOS was really strong and observation was lower? Is it the other way around? That's why we want to commit to continuing to provide those separate aspects of LOE.
Okay.
The question is, how are those scored? How are those weighted? Is LOE scored? I think those are all different things we can discuss.
Okay.
The other issue, to my mind, with LOE is that for teachers who do not have their own individual TVOS, their school-level TVOS is used in their LOE for a certain percentage. So in that case, we'd almost be holding a provider accountable for the scores of every teacher in that school, whether or not, surely they didn't train all of the teachers in that school. So that introduces a bit of variability where we would be holding a provider accountable for the results of folks they didn't train. Whereas right now on our TVOS metric, we only report that for folks who had their own individual growth score. So I taught 8th grade social studies, this is my 8th grade social studies score, not I taught 8th grade art, here's the school-wide TVOS for my school. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think because of all those various factors is the reason that people said, well, yeah, we think there ought to be something, but let's throughout 2019, let's look at various forms before no decisions were made and no commitments were made to do anything. Let's think about it and not do it haphazardly and not do it rapidly, but let's go through the process.
So then perhaps at your next subcommittee meeting, you'll be digging into that and coming back with a future recommendation then, is what I'm hearing.
That's what we plan to do over spring 2019. We're actually going to be joined by a fellow from Vanderbilt, which we're excited about, who's in a graduate program there. She's going to help us coordinate several different opportunities across the state for stakeholder engagement with both providers, with districts, and potentially even with maybe students or high school counselors who work with students who are interested in becoming teachers. So because we do have this opportunity for a bigger design refresh, we really want to make sure we're including as much information as is relevant as we can. It's always a balance between providing, we could provide every single piece of information, and it'd be hard for folks to sort out what's what without a degree in statistics. but making sure that we're hitting the high points and that we're getting our stakeholders to understand what we're doing and that we're hearing their voices.
Yeah, and this is Sarah. I would just put a kind of an exclamation point on that, because I think, again, you'll hear from Michael here in a few moments about the annual reports, which are much more data heavy and geared specifically for our programs as they think about how to make improvements and continue to reflect on the content of what they're offering to these candidates. The report card really is singular in that it's, designed for a general audience, and we want to make sure that it's as useful as possible to all of those stakeholders who would be consuming the information that we provide. And having this fellow who can help us really make sure we're drawing in as many voices and as much input as possible to refine it for 2019 when we imagine a more major set of revisions will be possible is important, because again, I think we've done the best we can with the advisory council and through TACD and other sort of avenues to get input to date, and we've tried to reflect that in the iterations each year without changing too much. I think, as Amy said, 2019's report will be a chance to make some more substantive changes after 3 years of data, after 3 years of sort of reporting, and so making sure that we have as much input from the field as possible is important, and I think we'll be able to do that with the help of this fellow.
Sarah and Amy, I know every state is different, and I met 1 or 2 states at Excel and Ed who were talking about our report card, and Catherine, I know there was one from South Carolina that had met you, and they were very eager to hear more about our report card and how we were doing this. But do we have any data or any best practice information from any other state that may be more aligned with how we, the different components of LOE and the sum of the scores? Do we have any data that would help our fellow when she comes along and begins to help with the research?
So, Lillian, this is Sarah. Unfortunately, a lot of things drive the state's ability to do this kind of work. Namely, though, having a teacher evaluation system where the state is collecting that data centrally is sort of critical to being able to report back to your program. So there's very few states that even have that data through their state evaluation system that would allow them to do the kind of report that we do for teacher prep programs. We are in close communication and have been over the last number of years, from the time when I was at the department to the time now, obviously, at the state board, with states like Delaware, Louisiana, I'm looking at Michael Durline, Massachusetts. That's right. There's a small handful who have evaluation data that they can begin to think about using for teacher prep programs. I think Delaware and Louisiana are the ones that have been kind of out sort of where we were initially doing reports like this, and we've learned with them, but I wouldn't say there's much that they're doing that we're not aware of or learning from at this point.
Okay.
Just a small handful of states that are in this kind of space able to provide this information back to their programs.
I suspected, but I wanted to ask nonetheless. Thank you.
No, it's a good question, like I said, and we're continuing to scan the field to see if there's anybody else coming online with this sort of information, but it's a few states, really, that we talk to.
One thing that's helped and that we're excited about for 2019 is that the vendor we work with to produce the report card has been making K-12 school report cards for several states recently, and just looking at that, we've been really excited by some of the designs they've used in that context and been thinking about how we could list them to our website. So, for example, if somebody wanted to pick 3 providers that were relevant to them and compare and contrast, that could be a kind of feature you could have. Or even having a map of Tennessee where somebody can zoom in on the area where they wanted to go to school and see providers in that region. So we're really excited about both the aesthetics of the website that we can design as well as the underlying framework and information we can include.
Great, thank you.
I'll just hit one more thing on this slide. This will be the first year that we have a module on leader preparation. We have several programs in the state, Michael probably knows the exact number, that produce school leaders, about 18. 18 providers also train folks to be school leaders. And previously we had not reported information on those programs. This year we're dipping our toe in the water. It's going to be a pretty basic module with some demographic statistics and some narratives from those programs about, what is the mission of the program, what's the structure of it. And what we'd like to do over the next several months is continue working with our providers, with districts, and with education researchers. There are a couple at Vanderbilt who've really dug into this to determine what metrics might be appropriate to score regarding leader prep. You can imagine that this is more complicated than with teachers, because I might go to school to get my beginning administrator license, but go back and teach in the classroom for 5 more years before getting my first assistant principal job. So at that length of time, is it really appropriate for my eventual results to reflect back on my provider. And is there a difference if I'm an assistant principal or a principal? You can see that there's many different things going on there. But we'd like to work with all of our different stakeholders to think about what might be the best way to provide some sort of quantitative information on those programs. Alrighty. Briefly, we'll walk you through our report card production and communication timeline just so you can know what's coming next.
Sure, yeah. Hello, this is Catherine McElvin. As Amy mentioned with you, we're working in tight partnership with TDOE's team to make sure that all of our data processes we're working from the same data set for the report card and the annual report. We're using really robust data quality processes to ensure the best data quality and across both. We'll be putting this together and sending out data to the EPPs for review in mid to late January. This will allow them a few weeks to look at, if their data is accurate, if the little descriptions that will be showed on the report card are what they want to share out, and just to get familiarity and prepare their communication structure beyond that. We'll have a few weeks in January, and then we'll be sharing out and publicizing the report card February 15th.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. One thing that we also did this year, TAXI, is the Tennessee Association of the Colleges of Teacher Education. They have a couple annual conferences, and at their one in the fall, they were kind enough to fill out some information sheets on things they wish we would do differently or could improve about the report card. And as Catherine was discussing, one of the things that they would really like to know is more advance notice of when the data review and embargo windows will be. So, for example, telling them ahead of time, you can expect to get the data to review on January X. They said that having that advance notice will help them prepare to have their staff ready to look at it. So we definitely need to do that, clearly communicate changes for the report card to EPPs, and consider ways to expand EPP feedback in advance of this 2019 refresh. So several things that we're doing to address that. We will have this data review window, which we've had in previous years, where programs get a spreadsheet that lists every completer. So, Catherine, Elizabeth, Michael, their data that we have for them. So race, ethnicity, gender, what kind of program, and where possible, information on observation and TVOS scores. Some of those things we can and can't share out. So if we can't share out the exact score, we just put like a yes, they counted for you in this area, even if we can't put the person's score. So they validate that. We will send each program its own PDF version of their specific report card during an embargo window so they can prepare their own responses and communications. What we're also going to do is, let me go back one, as we think about how we're communicating changes to the report card. The one-pager that I gave you with your meeting materials and it's on our website listing the 2018 enhancements and 2019 options, we will send out to our listserv of EPP contacts this week. The Department of Ed has also agreed to have it run in their monthly EPP update newsletter for the next 2 editions. In that way, we hope that there's no surprises and everybody knows what to expect on the report card this year. Finally, I'll just put in a quick plug. We do have a monthly newsletter that we put out as a state board. You can sign up on our homepage on our website, and we'd encourage our EPPs to sign up for that. It'll have information about the report card launch, but also about our regular meetings, so they can keep track of policy and rules relevant to them. And if there are any questions regarding the report card, I'm happy to take them now. Otherwise, I will let Michael chat a little bit about the annual reports. I know they're going through a pretty parallel process to us. Okay. All right.
Great. Thanks, Amy. You will probably get sick of us saying this, but I did want to also reiterate how closely the board staff and department have worked together on this year. I've been involved in the production of the annual reports from their inception, and I think this year has been probably one of the best years as far as operations related to project management, data quality, and so I'm really excited about that. We don't have very many changes to note. I did want to just kind of reiterate some of the things that Amy went over related to provider impact. We are definitely working closely with the board to make sure that we maintain similar business rules around LOE and TBOS decisions. We too are working on producing some basic demographic data for leader prep. And we've worked very closely with the board on the highlights module related to literacy, since we have recently carried out those literacy reviews. I would also just add on the, I think I mentioned this the last time we spoke about this, but EPPs have had a significant interest in getting even more granular data beyond the Insights tool, which has surprised us a little bit, but we are planning on creating an individual candidate level file that will allow them to do their own analyses beginning this spring. That may not come out at the exact same time the annual reports are released, but we hope to provide that to them very shortly after. They also are seeking the ability to print, which is something that makes us cringe a little bit because we wanted it to be an online, a solely online platform, but we've heard a lot of feedback from folks saying that they like to have, they would like to have some printable version that they can take to specific faculty meetings that they may host. With respect to satisfaction surveys, we are making a shift this year. Previously, in our district survey that was released through a district, the district survey that the department releases in the form of a module, our response rates were fairly low on that, and we weren't always certain it was going to the most appropriate person that had the right information about the quality of partnerships between their district and the EPP they were responding about. So as a result, we are creating a primary partnership inventory, which was actually something that we were using previously in the form of a needs assessment. And as we begin to collect primary partnership agreements for the first time this February, we will have information about the exact contacts who would be most appropriate to respond to that inventory. And then shortly after that in February, we plan to release the inventory to those individuals and use that data for the annual reports as opposed to relying on the district survey that was released by the department.
Questions about the annual reports or any further information or follow-up you'd like from Michael?
No questions, but I appreciate the great update, Michael. Thank you.
Can we get a set of the slides or something that he was talking from? That would be helpful as a refresher.
He's speaking extemporaneously. He's got it all in his head.
Okay.
And I took notes, and I know that we always use the recording of the meeting to serve as our minutes, but I was taking notes. So if you'd like, I can certainly send, I wrote down everything he said. Happy to send that to you.
Thank you,
That'd be great, Liz. Thank you.
Well, I would like to just take a minute to thank Catherine on our team and Kevin, Derajay, Hugh on the department side. They have been working together extremely intensely on this data coding and quality assurance, and like Michael said, this is the tightest linked and the cleanest we think it's ever been. We're really, really impressed with our data team, and we're very, very lucky to have them. All right. So turning over the page a little bit from annual reporting to a different topic, we're going to I honestly don't have a clear structure for this. I'm interested in getting your feedback on what you want to see our next possible directions here. On licensure flexibility options. The context is that at our October board meeting, several members requested more information on what licensure flexibility options there are and what those look like. Bob, this is specifically coming from a question you raised about chemistry, the high school course, no longer having an end of course exam. You'd heard that that meant, could anybody teach it, even if you don't have a chemistry endorsement? And so you wanted to know more information about these methods of flexibility. So I'm going to start out by just defining what these are. Michael can provide some more insight onto how often they're used about. And then it's really just an opportunity for the three of you to share what else, in terms of information or policies you'd like to see us pursue. The three options, no problem. The three options we're going to discuss are permits, waivers, and the one-out provision, which I have also heard called the two-out provision. Sarah and I actually had a long debate about this yesterday, so if you hear anything being a something out provision, it's probably referring to this. What these are, a permit can be issued by the department when, even though they had a targeted recruitment strategy, a district or charter school is unable to obtain the services of a licensed educator for the type and kind of school in which a vacancy exists. So you've got a vacancy you need to fill, you tried really hard, you had a targeted recruitment strategy, and you just can't find someone to teach it. That person has to have a bachelor's degree if they're teaching outside of one of the CTE occupational areas. A waiver is for a teacher who's already a licensed teacher to teach more than one course or more than two sections of that one course outside their area of endorsement on what's called an employment standard waiver. So that's, I'm the social studies teacher. They need me to teach 2 English courses that year. I also need to teach English, well, that's an EOC course, but let's say journalism and creative writing, and my endorsement wouldn't let me do that. I could apply for a waiver. I have to have an active teaching license and endorsement in another area. The one out, go ahead.
I'll add something on the waiver. It is issued, the permit is issued 1 year at a time for no more than 3 years. The waiver is issued for up to 3 years. However, the individual has to show progress being made in obtaining the endorsement or adding the endorsement to their license that they would need to be able to teach the course that they're teaching. So the first year it can get you without any qualifications except for holding that license. The second year they have to have either passed the required content tests and or be enrolled in an additional endorsement program. And then the third year they have to have passed tests and have made progress in the program.
Thank you.
How do you reckon the kids fared in that very first year? It's a rhetorical question, by the way.
Sure. Let me get to the one-out provision, and then we'll have a more holistic discussion. The one-out provision is for a teacher to teach up to 2 sections, so, the 8:30 class and the 9:30 class, of one course outside their area of endorsement. So again, me, the social studies teacher, teaching 2 sections of, let's say, journalism, same course, 2 different sections of it. That does not need any specific approval or request to the department or the board. That is just something that's allowed to happen in terms of flexibility. Across the board, these options do not apply to courses with an end-of-course exam or special education courses. You can't take your social studies teacher and have them teaching special ed the whole day or teaching biology. They need to be teaching, for those courses, you need to have somebody with the appropriate endorsement area. So what I'd like to do here is have Michael take a few minutes to tell you how often these are used to give you some context, and then have a discussion on just basically your reactions to this.
So for some context, and I had hoped to get more granular data on the exact areas that these are used, that we're having some issues with the format of the data source that we're using. But historically, pre-2015, we issued around 50 to 75 permits a year and around 150 waivers. The number of waivers since then has not really increased. The number of permits has, and we believe that that's a result of 2 things. One, our data systems are better, so that when districts have to staff someone in the evaluation side of TN Compass, our data system, those individuals should hold an active license, and so they're able to interact with that system to confirm that. And 2, we are getting better at merging our data sources to be able to notify districts when we identify that someone is employed and does not hold a license. And so we are seeing an increase in the use of permits, which is actually a good thing because it then allows us to collect and report data that we may not have previously had. So that's just some context. As soon as I can get more granular data on this, I will certainly prepare kind of a 1-pager that would give you a better summary of exactly the areas that it's being used in. But historically, and anecdotally, I can say that it's not any one area. It's kind of spread across all the available endorsement areas. But I would say also kind of anecdotally, permits are used as in most cases in emergency situations. So I was just speaking with the director last week who a teacher just decided they were not going to teach anymore in the middle of the year, and they left. And that director was stuck trying to figure out exactly what to do. They posted the position. They were in a very small rural district, and they struggled to get applicants, and they needed to use that emergency credential to be able to hire someone who had not passed the praxis yet, and they were working to do that. So there are many. There are other districts, some larger districts that I think could do a better job of partnering with their local EPPs and have a stronger pipeline of educators from those providers coming to their district. And so sometimes they're using permits in more the old-fashioned way where they need a teacher tomorrow and haven't necessarily done the best job recruiting or communicating with their partners. So I think it kind of runs the gamut of how it's used, but they are used as emergency credentials to be able to fill a position, and we do have that data now. So,
Michael, this is Sarah. I think that's important to kind of highlight that, you know, again, this is not something that's to be used for a long-term sort of fix, but it's a short-term sort of remedy. Can you talk a little bit more about what you were indicating will be sort of the additional capabilities in our data systems to kind of monitor and ensure that that's how it's being used? Because I think that's important, and the board members might want to know kind of what that might look like in practice.
Yeah, so what I can say is that when we can get to a point where we can connect our licensure systems and the courses that people are actually teaching, we might be able to better identify the specific areas where we're seeing challenges. That information should then be used to inform conversations with primary partners. So we while we have said it for a number of years, we expect that EPPs and their primary partner districts are having conversations about needs annually. But we know that historically that hasn't been the case. There have been more conversations that have been reactionary and in the moment. I need to fill a position tomorrow, and who do you have? But we hope to be able to support, as we're able, districts to understand exactly which areas those are being used most frequently so that they can then have those conversations that are a little more proactive with their EPPs.
So just so they're clear, I mean, because again, this is exciting to me when I learned that we'd be able to do this hopefully over the coming years with our data. But if you're a district, you'd be able to see, okay, this year I've got 5 people who are on a permit for special education, or 5 teachers. Not special education, that's a bad example. Let's say, fill in the blank, middle school art.
Right.
But regardless, you'd be able to run that data sort of annually to share with your primary program partner to say, this is an area of need. We've got people on waivers this year. We really need to make sure we're trying to fill that pipeline and have a more informed conversation about recruitment.
That's the hope. This is also a big part of so we are now reporting on this through the EdFax system for our to meet ESSA requirements. And I would note that also through ESSA, there's a requirement that districts notify parents if there are teachers that are teaching out of their area of endorsement, and that includes all 3 of these provisions. So we sent out a notice in the commissioner's update almost a month ago now, I believe, and we're getting some questions from districts just to clarify exactly what they need to notify parents of. And it is, in fact, in all cases, they need to notify the parents that the teacher is teaching out of their content area. So we're also working on a possible template that districts could use. So there's kind of a standardized way that they can report to parents.
So
Hey,
Michael,
let me ask.
But one day, let's
Okay.
see, Mike's before it.
I'm sorry. Mike,
So students are, parents are notified of their child being taught by a teacher outside their endorsed area. What's their remedy?
They can request to have that student moved about the class. I mean, that's a local decision, but.
Yeah, I don't know that we.
Yeah, I had a parent or grandparent call me from Scott County that their student was in algebra being taught by a gym teacher that didn't know the math, and she was just going to end up moving her student into Anderson County. Was her option.
We would definitely want
I have several questions too. I don't know if when Mike gets finished, I've got several questions to ask about this.
Ed, you please go. Bob, you go first, which will help me get rid of 90%
Okay.
of my questions.
All right. So first, let me say I'm glad that you're tracking this data. I think it's good to have. But when you say there's 50 to 70 permits that are being issued annually, how has that changed over time? Is that growing, staying? You said the waivers were staying pretty the same at 150. What's the number of permits? How's that changing?
I don't want to say an exact number because I'm literally digging into that data right now, but I do think that it has increased at least by 100 since 2015. So
that's a pretty significant increase, which says that, to me, the biggest challenge that we have in the Department of Education State Board, I think, is encouraging good quality teachers to go into teaching. I think it's a statewide problem that I see across the state. So somehow we got to figure out what we're going to do to get good quality people to go into teaching. Now, secondly, another question on your one-out provision. Teacher can teach up to 2 sections out of their endorsement area, and they can only do that for a year or something like that. What happens if in 1 year one teacher say, well, all right, I'm going to teach chemistry, which doesn't have an end-of-course exam, but I'm in social studies, but I'm going to teach chemistry. I'm going to do that for 1 or 2 classes. And the next year they don't have a chemistry teacher, and somebody else says, well, I'm the typing teacher, so I'm going to be the chemistry teacher this year. I mean,
Bob,
go ahead.
You actually teach on you could use the one-out provision. There's no time limit on that.
Okay.
So you could be teaching, if there's only a few kids who want to take a course in a given year, and, I'm going to go back to the example of I'm a social studies teacher and I need to teach creative writing. Every year, let's say there's only 10 kids who want to take it, I could just do that in perpetuity. There's nothing saying eventually I have to go get an endorsement in that area.
So I think that's a real concern that we can have teachers doing that who aren't endorsed in an area teaching our students without that endorsement. And that all goes back again to the issue on getting a statewide initiative to encourage people into the teaching career. And then the last thing that brings me to is, and I've talked to several people here in the area here, and when we went to Roane State, I mean, that was what we heard from Roane State and from the Roane County people, that one of the biggest challenges they have is getting people qualified to teach, whether it's welding or whatever else, because they could go to North Dakota for 4 months and work 4 months out of the year. So somehow I think we need to think about, like I say, some statewide initiative. And I do know that we used to have a program where people who were retired professionals could go back, and I know we have that, but maybe we ought to relook at that program, and is there something that we can tweak to that program to get people back into the teaching profession? Just a thought.
I want to jump in on that point that you just made, Bob, because I actually did an op-ed, and Nathan and Elizabeth Tolos helped me with that about this very subject matter, because we do need to do something, I believe, on a statewide basis to encourage this career path. Now, that's easier said than done, but also to your point about alternate certifications for professionals. This has been surfacing. I've heard, actually, when I was at Excel and Ed last week, and Nathan was there with me. And Nathan, I don't think you heard this presentation, but it was about Wisconsin was having a huge issue. They lost 50% of their teachers in a 5-year period of time, and their legislature passed a law that allowed their districts to hire teachers, alternate to the professionals, as you indicated. They are seeing extreme success with that model. Because I will tell you, and Michael, you can tell me if the data has changed, but there is a prediction that by the year 2025, there will be 20,000 open slots, teaching slots, in the state of Tennessee. So I think we need to know how many people are graduating each year from all of our EPPs, and in what endorsement area are they getting their credential. I think we need to be assessing those kinds of gaps. And maybe you all are already doing that, Michael, but if that prediction is true, we're going to even have a far greater challenge, I believe, than we have today. So we do need to, I think, from a legislature, from a policy, from an overall citizenry, because I'm saying everybody's a part of this equation. The narrative has to change. We have to stop people from being discouraged from that profession. Educators discourage their children. Educators discourage their students. It's just not going to allow the problem to be turned around if we don't start being a part of that positive narrative. And that means everybody. We're all in this together. That's my 2 cents.
I agree with you.
Well said, Lily.
We do track at the state level our completers over time on the state report card, and it has decreased by several hundred over the past couple years. One thing I think we should probably bear in mind, we do have this shortage of teachers. So when we talk about these licensure flexibility options like permits, waivers, and one out, you know, it's a case of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, in my view, of, okay, maybe I teach social studies, I'm not the best person to teach creative writing, but I'm a licensed teacher with an active endorsement, I'm used to teaching high school, I can try to learn the content and do the best I can for those students, versus simply not offering the class.
Or having a long-term sense.
Or having a long-term
tension
sense.
there between how we think about licensure requirements and the number of waivers and permits. I think there are different creative ways that we could begin to explore, though, to, like you said, Amy, not necessarily give up on our licensure requirements, but also be sure that the people that are, you know, short-term filling in for those classes or are long-term getting the endorsement they need. Michael, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, a few kind of thoughts on this. So, yes, we're definitely capturing that data, endorsement level data, and who's being prepared materials. And I would also say, I'll go back to some research that the data and research team did a few years back around shortages, and that shortages are actually localized in specific areas and in specific geographical areas, and within that in specific endorsement areas. So it's not necessarily, there are definitely areas where there are many districts that are seeing shortages, and that's why we have the high needs endorsement areas on both the report card and annual reports, but the degree to which there are shortages in those areas varies by district. So I want to kind of throw that out there. I also, a few other...
Do you also think there's some areas where we're overproducing, like elementary ed still?
I don't know.
Or do you think that's
I think we should look at that data to be able to say that, because I think there might also be some districts that I wouldn't go so far as to say have a shortage in elementary, but need that production of elementary. So I don't know if that's true across the board either. I would also add that there are a few other pathways that we have. We've got the fairly newish 9-12 pathway for educators who are teaching at the post-secondary level who may have that background in a content area. They can, through that new-ish law, they can obtain a license to teach grades 9 through 12. There's the adjunct teacher license, which is really just specific to one program out of Knoxville, I believe. And that's one that I think has been kind of underutilized or utilized specific to that program where they have a master's degree or bachelor's degree in the subject area. Obviously, there's occupational licensure where there are professionals coming out of those jobs and entering job-embedded teacher preparation programs. Those programs are now about to be under review, and that's something our office is engaging in to make sure that they are of high quality. And then lastly, I would say that there's the teaching as a profession course at the high school level. Too often we've heard that high schools are not, on career day, they're not highlighting what it means to be a teacher and providing high school students with a clear understanding of what that career entails and getting them excited about it. So there is some work being done to, at a minimum, allow some flexibility on who can teach the series of courses that are teaching as a profession. I'm not the best person to speak about those courses, but At some point, if we'd like to, we can bring somebody in who can. Historically, only one endorsement area, teachers holding one specific endorsement area were allowed to teach that course, and I think we want to open that up so that more students can be exposed to that pathway. But I definitely agree. I think this is an area we should focus on.
Michael, this is Lillian again, and thank you for saying that, because I think there may be an opportunity, even with our core offices, to begin talking to all the teachers, supervisors, you name it, at every level, because I know in my day job I'm trying to do a lot of that on the focusing with 6 school districts that I work with in my day job. And so we're actually launching education as a pathway with one of our local superintendents serving as the chair of that committee and bringing in the other directors of schools as well as teachers, counselors, you name it, to talk, putting that positive spin and encouraging students. There they have a ready workforce standing in front of them every day, and they're doing nothing to, I shouldn't say that because I think there's some that are rock star teachers that are really inspiring their students to want to go that path. But I think a more deliberative, intentional approach to addressing this with the districts across the board might be a way to go, and utilizing the core offices may be a great way to do that. Professional development is one part of it I'm thinking of too.
So I want to get back to permit waiver and out of provision. I think we do have to increase our teaching profession across the state and in the nation. We got to do a very deliberate job, but specifically on allowing people to teach in non-endorsed areas is what I want to talk about specifically. I think that we have to really know, kid, and pay attention, make a decision, a statement that endorsements either matter or they don't matter. And if they matter for all the kids, but they also matter for that 1,000 to 1,400 kids who, according to those that are reporting these, and I think those are underreported just based on me walking down the halls of a whole lot of schools. We have standards, and we require kids to take courses because we want them. We believe they need to have that knowledge in order to have an adequate education in today's day. We work very hard on those standards, and we hire teachers who are specialists in those areas to be able, who have the knowledge and the contents, knowledge and skills to teach that. To be able to put a history major into a social studies deal may or may not work out. We need to really think about our endorsements if they're really important. But that same history major, and I'm using the history major as a good example because that's what I am, into a chemistry class. It's not that we don't have a chemistry teacher, so therefore we need to get the history guy in there. We don't have a chemistry teacher either way. Those kids who are sitting in that classroom do not have a chemistry teacher, are not going to likely, unless they're self-teaching, going to master at some level that chemistry. And that, when you're looking at where the shortages are, it's where, by and large, where those classes are the toughest to get. And it's the sciences, it's the math, and it's the foreign languages, and certainly special ed. Well, we've called out special ed because we know, well, we couldn't go that far. But we're really whistling by the graveyard and pretending this is not a big deal. And if you're one of those kids sitting in the class, it may not be a big deal on the scale across the state, but if you're one of the kids in that class, it is a big deal. And it's a question in my mind of is this in the best interest of the kids? And I'm going to argue no, it isn't. I'm going to argue that as long as this is available to school districts, they are going to utilize it. And until we take this option away from school systems, they're not going to develop strategies to put qualified people in those classrooms. I think, and that's where I'm heading with this. I'm going to ask the chairperson that we have an item on the agenda that we discuss this with possible action with the intention of rescinding all three of these.
So, Mike, you're saying at the next, our regular board meeting, that's what you're requesting? At our next regular board meeting?
Yes.
Okay. I want to hear more from Sarah and Amy and Michael and others on this subject matter, because first and foremost, I don't think anybody would dispute or disagree with you, Mike, because I think we all want teachers with the proper endorsement in the classroom. I don't think there's any question about that. My personal concern, and this is my personal opinion, I don't think anybody intentionally wants to put somebody in a classroom who does not have the proper endorsement. And I think until we deal with the teacher shortage, and come up with alternative ways to get teachers with the proper endorsement in the pipeline, then what alternative do they have?
Let me make a point.
Go right ahead.
Absolutely right. Until we get that corrected. But that's going to require an entire society's involvement, us included. But we solely are responsible for allowing a non-endorsed teacher to teach a kid in Tennessee. We're solely responsible for that.
Let me say this. I totally understand what Mike is saying, and I support what he's saying from the standpoint of, we should not allow non-endorsed teachers teaching these courses. It gets back to what Lillian said. We got to figure out a solution to that. I do have concern about going off and rescinding that without having an effective plan in place on how we get to where we can get these endorsements. Some people may say, oh, well, you can use course access, you can use visual, somebody can dial into Williamson County and get the course that way. I want to have a conversation about that someday too, because I sit in on the TN Ready procurement oversight, and I can't say a whole lot about that, but while I was in there, I got inundated from various superintendents about our course access, and very good questions. I think they had excellent questions about it. And I think everybody agrees that, there's benefit about this, but again, the implementation of how you implement this. So before we jump into, we can have the conversation, but before we make any decisions, I think we need to be sure that we've got a good path forward, that we don't put ourselves in a worse situation, that the kids then don't have any options whatsoever of not being able to take the course.
So, again, I agree with everything you're saying. In fact, I have great sympathy for the school district. I really don't think a school board can solve the strategic, operational issues. That's going to have to be done by each LEA. And there's things that we can do to help by making more people available. But they're going to, once they're faced with not having the ability to put a non-endorsed teacher in a classroom, will they then start to figure out how in the world they're going to be in compliance? And if we think that we're going to be able to do that for 144 LEAs, it's just not going to happen. We can pass rules that make it easier for them. We can work with the department to help in the EPPs. But as long as this thing is on the books, we're silly. We're just kidding ourselves that this is not going to be the first and last thing they go to.
Mike,
Yeah, that gives me concern.
sorry, before we dig in too far, I know, I'm pulling it up, that permits are in code. I need to double check on waivers
I think
and what
waivers
else.
are as well.
But we would need to do a little bit of follow-up from our staff on what any sort of process, if the full board did want to recommend a change, could look like. So can that be on my to-do list to circle back with this group?
Absolutely.
Yes, and the other thing, go ahead, I'm sorry, Sarah.
Go ahead, Lillian, I'll jump in after you're finished. I
No, I was just going to say, when you were speaking about the waivers and the process of the teachers in the first year, what they're required to do, the second, and of course they should be working toward getting their endorsement. Do we have data on all of those teachers who are teaching with waivers, and if they are moving the needle in the right direction and getting to their endorsement? Because this may be a way that's working and maybe they are being successful, but if we don't know that, if we don't have that data, I don't know how we can make an informed decision to even consider rescinding if we're even able to do that. Do we have that data?
That is a great question. Theoretically, we have that data. The ability to follow that and actually do that analysis would be challenging, but I can certainly look into that. I don't want to overpromise what we'd be able to do there, but I can say that it's a benchmark. It's we do not issue a waiver if a teacher has not made for a second year if a teacher has not met that expectation. So we've also been really, really thoughtful about the way in which we provide guidance around areas that educators can add endorsements by test only. Historically, the state board rule allowed anyone with a grade 7 in their license to add any other endorsement by test only. That was interesting, to say the least. And so what we did is provide guidance around test only options that were more aligned by grade area and content area as well. So we've kind of taken, and you all have taken kind of a multi-pronged approach to this challenge. And I know I don't think that there's necessarily a silver bullet here. I would be concerned about just eliminating these options, because what I hear from districts is that in most cases, they're using them in emergency situations with the hopes of identifying educators for those positions who will actually pursue the endorsement. And so I think that we would certainly want to look at this data more carefully and understand the district perspective as well, because I think there's a lot more here than we may think.
Mm-hmm. This is Sarah. Michael, I appreciate those thoughts too, because to me this is a really hard issue, because I completely agree with what Mike has put forward in terms of we've got to make sure students have the best person in front of them with content expertise, especially in some of these upper grade math and science courses where we know we have shortages as a state. So we've got to really think, to your point, Michael, about a multi-pronged approach as a state, because I think it may not be as simple as cutting off the valve for the waivers and permits, but it's got to be that I think as a board and as a department, at the state level, we're providing leadership and guidance around what we do think matters in terms of content expertise for teachers, and giving districts options and ways to solve that problem, if they find themselves in an emergency situation without a teacher. I can say from experience with the school that the state board has authorized in Memphis, our Bluff City High School. Last year we had a physics teacher who quit mid-year in that school, and so we were very much on the ground working with them on a solution. And they had to use, some of their other licensed teachers for the balance of that school year to instruct the physics curriculum. And again, not the best option, obviously, but while they were recruiting a physics teacher, which was challenging to do, we had to figure something out. So I think it is complicated, but I think we can't lose sight of Mike's point. And I think thinking about creative options for how, like you were saying, Michael, we really kind of limit the amount of time that someone could spend on a waiver and ensure that we're monitoring the progress towards the endorsement. I mean, this feels like a bigger conversation with districts, and maybe we need to ask their help in terms of tracking some of that information and conveying how important we think it is.
one of the things that I would ask that we do is not to try to identify those options within the parameters of how we think. And I'll give you an example. One, we have every district in Tennessee not only has the authority to do differential pay, they have the obligation to have a differential pay, they're required, a plan. So if a school district was sitting there really in trouble, they're short a chemistry teacher, and they have to decide, I've got a adjunct over here that I could pick up for $80,000 a year, or I can put an English teacher in this. Which is more important, that kid or that differential pay? And I bet that they're going to pick not paying the differential pay and being okay with an English teacher in chemistry, because that is what they have, that's the least line of resistance. We need to think through how to solve the problem, and not in the context of what public education is doing today.
Mike, I think you bring up some really interesting points that need some further discussion. If it's okay with you, I'd like to slate this for a workshop at one of the first 2 meetings of 2019. What we'll also have then is follow-up information on how many people are using permits and waivers, and in what subject areas. We can also come with information on the different options for alternative licensure pathways to speak to the recruiting people from different fields, and information on how the CTE Education as a Career courses are being updated and how districts could use them. We can, as we're formulating that workshop presentation, we'll check back in with you all to make sure we're hitting your high points. One other thing, I was really lucky to be able to work with the department to add a few questions to their annual district surveys human capital module to ask district HR professionals directly, what issues do you encounter when you're trying to hire people from Tennessee EPPs or from out of state, or get people to renew their license? What I'm hoping to do there is get more direct information on any rules or policies that we have that might be barriers unintentionally, not something that is hard because it serves a purpose, but that turned out to just be hoop jumping. So we can see if we can address shortage issues that way. If y'all are okay with it, we've got a really fascinating presentation coming up that I'm hoping to turn to. Does anybody have a final word on this?
Well, Sarah, I mean, I always feel like we're cutting this discussion short, and Mike feels passionately about this for good reason. I want to make sure we don't shortchange the discussion, so I do think it's going to be important to come back at the workshop and more fully discuss and look at what Mike's proposed, which, I mean, again, I think we should really contemplate what it would mean to take those options off the table, and, you know, short of doing that, what are the things that we should be pushing on from the state level to ensure that districts are really actively solving these issues with all the arrows they have in their quiver. Like Mike said, I mean, I think we have to think really creatively, and differential pay is definitely something that should factor into that discussion. So I don't want to lose sight of this really important conversation.
Yeah, the only reason I said it might be the second board meeting of 2019 would be to give time to get that survey data back so I can present to you more concrete information on challenges districts are facing in hiring, if that's okay.
I fully agree. We need to press on and continue this later.
Okay.
I think we all agree, though, it's a serious issue that we need to work on this year for sure.
Yep, we will keep it top of mind, and I promise to come back to you with a plan for when we revisit. So with that, let's keep moving, because I do think Dr. Ron Felt's on the line, and he's got some really interesting information that I know I'm really excited to hear about. So Amy,
sure. We're really lucky to have Dr. Matt Ronfelt from the University of Michigan joining us today. He's been working closely with Michael and Kevin at the department to do research on clinical mentoring. Michael, do you want to say any words before I turn it over to Matt?
I'll just briefly, this is, I asked Matt to present to you all as kind of a follow-up to our last meeting, and Matt spent a day with us just a few weeks back presenting this information, and I found it to be extraordinarily interesting with some potentially concrete next steps for the department and maybe even the board to consider. But at a minimum, I just wanted to give him the opportunity to provide you with the initial findings that they've had through a number of different research projects that they've engaged in. So I'll turn it over to Matt.
Hi, can you guys hear me? I want to make sure that I can see you all, but I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Oh,
Yes.
great. First, thank you so much for taking some time to let me come and speak with you all. I appreciate the opportunity. Let me, I guess, by way of starting, you can go to the next slide. I wanted to first just say that the talk today is really going to be focusing on a partnership that colleagues, myself and some colleagues have had with the PDOE for a number of years, focusing on leveraging data to improve teacher education in Tennessee. These are the talk today. I'll be sharing some preliminary results. I want to just note that the work is ongoing and some of this is subject to change, but I wanted to make sure that we have, an opportunity to share some of the interesting work that we've come up with so far. Few acknowledgments. I want to mention first to thank the Tennessee Department of Education for all their support. A number of EPPs, providers across the state of Tennessee who participated in the work, and many colleagues across the country really who've supported it, and as well as our funders, the Gates Foundation and IES. A bit of background just to lay the foundation for what I'll be presenting on today. I actually started working with the state back in 2013 when we began to look at whether or not it was possible to identify if there are significant and meaningful differences between EPPs in terms of their graduates' observation ratings. There had been a lot of work done by other researchers that have looked at achievement gains or TVOS scores, but the work hadn't looked at whether or not we can detect differences between EPPs in terms of their graduates' observation ratings. Indeed, we found that there were significant and meaningful differences, which was some really important work identifying that there are likely effects of teacher preparation programs on graduates' performance. This, over time, led to, in 2015, us joining forces on an IES State Longitudinal Data Systems grant. And that grant has two different arms to it. The first was to begin by using historical data in Tennessee to identify features of teacher preparation that seem to positively predict better workforce outcomes for graduates. And then, based on that set of analyses, to design initiatives that leverage those features of preparation for program improvement purposes. This has all led to a focus on clinical mentors. Clinical mentors are those mentor teachers that are working with teacher candidates during their student teaching and residency experiences. This slide really summarizes our talk today. If you find yourself falling asleep at any point, now would be the time to wake up, just to get a handle on the main sort of research questions and findings that we came up with. In terms of analyses of historical data on clinical mentors, the questions that drove our work are the following. First, are program completers more instructionally effective when they learn to teach with more instructionally effective clinical mentors? We find that yes, this is in fact the case. And by the way, I'll elaborate in more detail each of these research questions and findings in subsequent slides. The second question is, do teachers do worse on evaluation scores in years that they serve as clinical mentors? We find that no, they don't. And in fact, there's some evidence that they may do slightly better on observation ratings. These analyses led us to begin two initiatives. We call these the Mentors Matter initiatives. The two initiatives are what we call the Replacement Initiative and the Training Initiative. For both of these, we're actually using experimental designs where we're randomly assigning program completers to either the initiative or business as usual teacher preparation to detect whether or not there are differences. The placement initiative, the basic idea is to use prior evaluation data on teachers in order to target our recruitment of those teachers who are most instructionally effective to serve as clinical mentors. The first question that we ask in that line of inquiry is, do districts that use the targeted recruitment strategies increase clinical mentor instructional effectiveness. In fact, we find that they do. Those districts using these strategies have more instructionally effective clinical mentors than other districts. And then moving forward, we'll be asking our program completers from these districts more instructionally effective themselves. This work is ongoing, so we won't have anything to report on today in that area. The second initiative is a training initiative where the state, along with a number of other collaborators, developed a training program. The focus of this training program is to support clinical mentors in using new coaching practices that the training focus on. And I'll say more about what those are in subsequent slides. The questions that we ask are, do clinical mentors feel the trainings have been useful? Definitely, we find evidence that that's the case. And moving forward, we'll be asking, do program completers with trained clinical mentors report better coaching experiences? And do they perform better on their own evaluation scores down the road? That's work that's ongoing. So to dig into each of these questions in greater detail, again, the first one is, are program completers more instructionally effective when placed with more instructionally effective clinical mentors? By way of background, increasingly across the country, states have been setting minimum requirements for teachers to serve as clinical mentors. Typically, these requirements focus on minimum requirements for years of teaching experience or tenure. Though a number of states, including Tennessee, which was amongst the first to adopt such a policy, they've begun to use things like evaluation scores, minimum evaluation scores, or instructional effectiveness measures to serve. These kinds of policies assume that in order to be an effective mentor of pre-service candidates, folks must also be instructionally effective with kindergarten or pre-kindergarten to grade 12 students. But there's actually not a lot of literature support to support that argument. So we set out to figure out whether or not there's any evidence that this is the case. And we ask whether or not program completers are more instructionally effective when they learn to teach with more instructionally effective clinical mentors. A bit on the data we used. This was actually a long process. The TDOE reached out to all EPPs across the state and requested historical data on who served as clinical mentors between 2011 and 2015. This yielded 21 EPPs across the state shared their data with the state, and this ended up being almost almost 3,000 program completers could be linked to almost 3,400 clinical mentors. These program completers we could then follow after they graduated from their EPPs and took jobs in the state. We could track them and link them to their evaluation data. The basic approach that we used were multi-level regression modeling approaches. I won't get too much in the weeds of the methods, but the basic idea is that what we were trying to do was to look to estimate program completer observation ratings as a function of clinical mentor observation ratings, or TVOS. What we were trying to detect was whether or not there were any relationships or positive associations between the eval scores of the program completers and those of their clinical mentors. Here's a slide that gives you an overview of the findings. The first column, there are two different outcomes we look at in this slide. The first column are for the program completer observation ratings. These are the observations they received after they graduated from their programs and started teaching in Tennessee. And then the second column are for the TVOS scores that the program completers received. The rows on the left are for the clinical mentor characteristics. The top row are the years of teaching experience the clinical mentors had. The observation ratings is on the row below that, and then the TVOS scores are the next three rows. In yellow, I've highlighted the statistically significant findings. What we see here in the first column is that there's a positive and significant relationship between program completer observation ratings and the observation ratings of their clinical mentors. In the second column, we see that there's a positive and statistically significant relationship between program completer TVOS scores and the TVOS scores of their clinical mentors. In summary, we find that program completers had better observation ratings when their clinical mentors also had better observation ratings, and this was true for TVOS as well. In terms of the size of the effect, we find that compared to program completers who had clinical mentors with ratings of a 3, those program completers who had clinical mentors with ratings of a 5 performed as though they had taught an additional year when they in their initial teaching experiences. This study is really the first empirical support for policies that are setting minimum requirements for instructional effectiveness to serve as a clinical mentor. They provide support for the policies that Tennessee has put in place. Since this study, there have been 2 additional studies, one in Chicago and one in the state of Washington, that have found really similar results, which suggests that these relationships may exist in other teacher labor markets as well.
Matt, quick question here. This is
Yeah.
Amy. So the sub-bullet on bullet 1, that's like saying when I'm a first-year teacher, if my clinical mentor had a rating of 5, I'm looking like I'm a second-year teacher. Is that correct?
That is right. Yeah, that's on average, that would be the right way to put it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so this seems promising, and it was fairly exciting to find these relationships. Despite this evidence, though, and despite the state policies that exist that set minimum evaluation requirements to serve as a clinical mentor, EPP leaders that we were speaking with also continued to report that their program completers were not always placed with the most instructionally effective clinical mentors. There are likely a lot of different reasons for why this may be the case, and certainly in work that I've done in other states, this isn't a problem unique to Tennessee. But one commonly mentioned reason is that clinical mentors fear that their evaluation scores may decline when they mentor program completers. So when they host a student teacher or a resident, teachers sometimes worry that their evaluation scores may go down. This led us to ask, do teachers actually receive different evaluation scores in years that they serve as clinical mentors? I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I want to make sure I get to the Mentors Matters initiatives, but I just wanted to mention that we're only aware of one other study that's looked at this, and it was in the state of Washington. And Dan Goldhaber and his colleagues, it's a working paper, found some evidence that these fears among teachers may have some warrant. Specifically, they found that teachers had slightly lower achievement gains in math in years when they hosted a student teacher. There were really small negative effects, and they were concentrated mostly among the lowest performing clinical mentors. The authors didn't look at observation ratings, which is something we wanted to look at, and we also wondered whether or not, the results may differ in Tennessee, where there are different state and evaluation contexts. So I'm going to breeze through this. Basically, we got unique data on clinical mentors from 18 different EPPs in the state. This yielded about 4,500 clinical mentors over about a 4-year window of time. We merged these data with evaluation data, teacher assignment data, and school characteristics. And our main approach was to look to see whether or not teachers had better or worse observation ratings or TVOS scores in years that they served as a clinical mentor as compared to other years in our data. The top row here is where you should really focus your attention. The first 2 columns are where we looked at the observation ratings of teachers, and the second 2 columns are where we looked at the TVOS scores of teachers. The coefficients there on the first rows, basically what they are they're comparing the years in which folks served as a clinical mentor as compared to other years. They're trending positive across the board, which suggests that actually, if anything, for observation ratings, they appear to be doing somewhat better. These aren't huge effects. It's about 5% of a standard deviation, which isn't very big, but what we were most afraid of is that we'd see negative effects, right? Because in this case, our take on it was even if teachers don't do better or worse, if they do just the same, that's actually a good sign, right? Because we do want instructionally effective teachers to serve as clinical mentors. To find that there's some slight positive effects was somewhat surprising and reassuring in some ways. We find that the TVOS scores are roughly similar. In one of our models, they did slightly better, but it's very small. So really, our takeaway here is that they do just as well on TVOS. I've summarized this overall. We see that teachers seem to get somewhat better observation ratings. There doesn't seem to be a difference in terms of TVOS. I want to note that there is some limitation to this analysis. We only were able to analyze those data from EPPs that provided us with clinical mentor data. We don't know if they generalize to all EPPs across the state, so we're hoping to reproduce this work moving forward. But at least currently, it appears that fears of receiving lower scores seem to be unwarranted, and evaluation scores may even benefit in some cases. So to summarize the first two studies here, instructionally effective clinical mentors seem to have a positive effect on program completer performance, and teachers seem to do just as well on their evaluation scores if they serve as clinical mentors. So that leads to the question, can we increase the number of instructionally effective teachers that serve as clinical mentors, or are there some, or is it that we've already, programs have already done their darndest to get the best teachers as clinical mentors, and we can't move the needle? This has led in part to what we've called the Mentors Matters initiatives. And there's actually two parts to these initiatives. The first is what we call the placement initiative, and the second is the training initiative. So there's two different initiatives that we're piloting currently. In both cases, what we've done is we've designed the initiatives so that we're randomly assigning program completers within their EPPs, either to the initiative or to whatever business as usual approach the programs typically use. And we do this in order that we can tell whether or not these initiatives actually work. We don't want to scale up anything until we know that they seem to be helpful to teachers in the state. The placement initiative, the basic idea is that we use existing evaluation data on teachers to target the recruitment of the most instructionally effective teachers to serve as clinical mentors. And I'll say more about how we do that exactly in a moment. The training initiative is an initiative that the state and a number of other collaborators have developed, which focus on training clinical mentors to improve instructional modeling and questioning, which is one of the indicators on the team rubric, and also to improve their feedback practices. In terms of the placement initiative, the rationale for this initiative is to support districts, school, and EPP leaders to prioritize evaluation information in their recruitment of clinical mentors. When EPP leaders are doing the recruitment of clinical mentors, they don't actually have access to the eval data. So this was one approach to try to support them to make sure that they're still able to target the most instructionally effective teachers. When district leaders are in charge of recruiting clinical mentors, they have access to the data, but we don't know whether or not they're prioritizing those data or have other considerations in their recruitment of teachers to serve as clinical mentors. So we decided that we would use this initiative to prompt them to focus on trying to target the most instructionally effective teachers. We did this this year as a pilot with TTU in Tennessee. Our basic approach is to identify the district's grades and subject areas in which TTU needed to recruit clinical mentors. We call these the blocks. So the particular districts or counties, the grade levels and the subject areas that they needed for the teacher candidates that they had in their programs. We then use the prior data on observation ratings, TVOS scores, and years of experience on teachers in those district grade subject blocks to identify the most instructionally effective teachers in each of those blocks. We created lists that basically identified folks that we'd like the districts to begin with when they target their recruitment, and then we randomly assigned neighboring districts either to focus their recruitment by using these lists or by doing whatever business as usual practices they've used historically.
So Lillian, I know you'll be interested. Tennessee Tech's in your backyard. We'll see the results from right around you.
Yes, I will be very eager.
So what we see here, the red line on the far left is where it says 0. If the points here were on that line, it would mean that the districts using the lists did got equally as effective equally as instructionally effective mentors as those who use the business as usual approaches. But we see that for all of our different measures of instructional effectiveness, we see that the districts that use these lists got mentors who were instructionally more effective than those who use the business as usual strategies. At the top, it's a little hard to see these words, so I'll just mention on the top are the observation ratings, and these are in standard deviation units. So this is about 0.3 to 0.4 standard deviation units better on observation ratings. And then the next 4 points below that are for each of the domains: instruction, environment, planning, and professionalism. And then the red dot is for TVOS, so they were more effective on TVOS as well. Average on the red line, math is the blue, green is ELA, and then the bottom dot there is years of experience. So they also had substantially more years of teaching experience. So in summary, using these lists to target recruitment increased the average instructional effectiveness of clinical mentors. The mentors in the treatment or the districts that use the lists ranked on average 6th in their blocks, whereas the mentors in the control group, their mentors were ranked around 42nd. Using the list boosted the instructional effectiveness of clinical mentors by roughly 15 percentile points. This led us to wonder in the future, and this is what we'll be tracking on moving forward, is do program completers that are assigned to the targeted clinical mentors have better instructional performance once they become employed? The training initiative takes us a different take. It's focused on, by way of background, clinical mentors typically report receiving little training and coaching practices. This is true in other labor markets as well. And in interviews we did with EPP leaders across the state, there was a strong interest in support for clinical mentor training. We also know that teachers in Tennessee, based on historical analyses, score lowest in the instruction domain, and questioning is one of their lowest indicators. So this led us to, and led the TDOE with other partners to develop a clinical mentor training program that's focused on coaching program completers on questioning and on feedback practices for clinical mentoring. And again, there's a random assignment of clinical mentors to receive the new training or to use whatever business as usual practices that exist in the programs. We've done 2 pilots so far in the spring and fall. The programs that have participated are listed there at the top, and we really appreciate their partnership. So to date, we've worked with 56 clinical mentors and 11 clinical supervisors in the training. The training were co-developed by team coaches, the Offices of Educator Effectiveness, Licensure and Prep, and National Teacher Residency. The trainings exist they exist of 2 webinars, 2 face-to-face trainings, interim application activities, including a digital mentoring handbook and what we call the GPS feedback guides, which are meant to help structure the ways in which mentors focus their conversations with their mentees. The trainings emphasize 3 mentor competencies: modeling effective instruction, providing actual feedback, and developing supportive relationships. And they focus on providing opportunities for mentors to practice applying effective questioning and feedback. To date, what we've done is collected feedback through online questionnaires of participants in the trainings. In the day 1 training, we have day 1 training results and day 2 training results. In day 1, there were 29 participants, and the training focused on helping mentors with questioning and feedback techniques. in general, the training was participants felt the training was highly beneficial and practical. 85% strongly agreed that they were glad they attended the training and would recommend it to colleagues. You can see on the right-hand side some of the more specific feedback in different areas. Excuse me. What you notice here is that the feedback generally had participants strongly agree or somewhat agree with the different statements on the questionnaire. Nobody strongly disagreed. There were a few mentions that were somewhat disagree, but in general, the feedback was quite positive. Here we got some open-ended feedback from participants. In blue are some really positive feedback we received, just some examples that we selected to share with you all. In red are the somewhat more critical comments, so you could get a range of responses. I'll let you read those for a second. In day 2, the training focused on using the GPS guides to gather evidence, develop next steps, plan lessons, and analyze student work. Participants, we did use some of the consider some of the feedback in designing the day 2 training, and it seemed to actually help out. Participants felt very strongly that the training was highly beneficial and practical. 100% strongly agreed that they were glad they attended. Almost 90% strongly agreed that they felt more prepared to mentor their candidates after the training, and 95% strongly agreed that they would recommend this training to a colleague. Again, the general feedback or open-ended feedback is here. You can see that some of the participants felt very strongly that the trainings were beneficial. And there were still some critical feedback that we'll take into consideration as we move forward. Now, again, this was a pilot year, so we're really done a lot of work to make sure that the training is getting developed. And at the end of the year, we're going to survey program completers and ask whether or not folks that were had mentors who were in the training report better coaching. We'll also track program completers into next year to see whether or not there's any evidence they are more instructionally effective. If initial results seem to be promising, we'll consider scaling up the trainings to include other EPPs down the road. So that's all I have for now. Are there any questions that folks had, or I don't know if Michael or Kevin have anything they'd like to add, if I skipped over anything too quickly?
No, Matt, I think you did a great job. I would just love to hear from board members about their initial reactions to some of this work. I know we've had some initial conversations. Matt presented this to the commissioner just a few weeks back, as I noted, and we've had some initial conversations about kind of next steps the department could take to kind of support some of the findings, but we're not quite at the point of making those decisions. We've just had some initial conversations. So I'd love to hear from folks about what stuck out to them as being of interest.
This is Lillian. I will jump in, and I do want to say that I really am impressed with the data that you have shared with us, and it all looks very promising. And I know you said it was a pilot year. I think also in the beginning you said that the work was funded by a grant. Did I misinterpret that this is grant funded, the work that you're doing?
In part, the IES State Longitudinal Data Systems grant that the state received is the backbone a lot of the work that I presented on today, especially around the clinical mentors work.
Because of course that begs the question: if it was funded by a grant, then when would that sunset, and how would this work continue to see it through with all of those data results that are still yet to be determined?
Yeah, Lillian. And this is Michael. So the grant officially ends September of 2019. However, we fully anticipate that we will apply for a no-cost extension because the first year of our grant was really kind of a planning year, and we have carried over dollars from that grant every single year. So at a minimum, a very minimum. We expect to be able to extend it through September of 2020, but even then, I think we'll have to assess what kind of dollars we have. That grant is also funding the development of the TN Atlas system, which will allow us to collect data from EPPs in a more standardized fashion to inform some of the sorts of things that we want to look at here. But yeah, I think we should be able to see the results through, at least the initial results. But it also, where I thought you were going with that question was about capacity related to delivering the training, and that is definitely one thing that is of interest to us, and we're trying to think creatively about if we wanted to continue this work moving forward, how could we do so in a way that would reach the most people in an effective and efficient way, and not lose fidelity of the content of the training and the way in which it's delivered.
And that was part of my second question, because I have a third one, and it relates to, so who did the instruction of the CMs?
Well, you have one of the deliverers of that training in the room. It's Kevin Schaff, who is the research manager on the IES grant. And we also utilized two of the team coaches for delivering that training as well. And they really had that background knowledge and expertise on the team rubric, and were able to dive deep into some of those indicators that Matt mentioned that we focused on. But Kevin, if you want to add anything.
Sure. One of the things I was thinking about, as you were asking about what our plans are for scaling up, that's one of the reasons why we've involved the clinical supervisors at the EPPs, and that is one route that we were considering. How can we make this sustainable? The other thing that we've been doing is developing these tools to serve as resources ongoing. So we have these what Matt referred to, the GPS guides, which are focusing teachers on the goals, the practices, and the next steps that they're trying to develop with their teacher candidates. So we have this suite of tools that we'll be offering, the digital handbook as well. So those we're hoping to standardize and make as clear as possible, so we can transfer that knowledge over after the the grant funding is gone. And at the same time, we're looking at what are the avenues to develop expertise both in clinical supervisors and in this initial group of clinical mentors, and perhaps look to them to continue the training along with the team coaches and other department people who are we're trying to build that knowledge base both in the tools and people.
Okay, thank you. That's great. And then the third question centers around the recruitment of the clinical mentors. I believe you said that, and I may have misinterpreted, that you may not have all the data or all the evidence related to the process that the districts have utilized to attract those clinical mentors, because I think there was some concern about the selection and certainly about the impact on their observations. And so, are you all capturing that data for the future so that we know that the recruitment process is as strong as it possibly can be, and that all of the concerns that anyone who would be the ideal clinical mentors are encouraged and not dissuaded from becoming a clinical mentor?
Yeah, Lillian, that's a great question. I will say just anecdotally that what I have seen is the process by which districts used to select clinical mentors varies significantly. You have some districts and schools that have a very thoughtful and pipeline-driven approach to that, recognizing that these student teachers are potentially going to be employed in their school or district, and so they place a high value on who they're selecting for that position. Whereas there are other districts and schools that send out an email to everyone and say, who wants to be a clinical mentor? Step right up. And I think that what we've seen now and where we hope the shift is going is that through the emphasis on primary partnerships between EPPs and LEAs, we are also focusing on the recruitment and selection of clinical mentors such that EPPs aren't feeling like it's completely out of their hands.
Right.
We want to a point where they're just as much involved in that process as districts are. And in some places, that's true already, but I think that we're hoping that through the accountability process, that is the primary partnership agreements, some of the CAPE language and the CAPE standards touch on this, we'll be able to encourage that shift. But as far as data collection, because that was kind of your actual question there, we have collected data on who serves as a clinical mentor through our report card and annual reports data collection process. We're also working on an amendment to the TN Compass system that would include that information for future use. And that's an area where down the road we could certainly start to look at patterns in districts as far as who is selected. And then the more qualitative side of it, the recruitment processes would be something we would have to collect kind of on a one-off basis, and might generate some sort of a survey or a targeted ask of EPPs and primary partner districts to collect the information that we would need to be able to get a handle on what that looks like across the state.
And I would also add that this is something that Matt has looked at. He didn't mention, but we've also done a landscape study where there was a series of 9 EPPs that were a series of qualitative interviews were done with those 9 EPPs across the state, from those EPPs ranging in size and location. And those interviews, part of that work was looking in depth at what are their practices in clinical preparation and how do they differ in both selecting and recruiting clinical mentors and in all aspects of their clinical preparation. So there's been some efforts to gather more qualitative information that goes beyond the anecdotal that Michael spoke of. And we also are collecting data, as Michael mentioned, on who serves as a clinical mentor, so that those initial results that Matt shared can be strengthened and we can have more confidence in those effects. We'll have a more complete data set of everyone who has served as a clinical mentor in the state of Tennessee.
Well, critically important. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
That made me think of is that placement initiative, the Mentors Matter placement initiative, where we were looking at using a more fine-grained look at data to try to select the absolute best of the best in terms of their evaluation data, and looking at whether those clinical mentors are having better impacts on their candidates than the group that is selected through the business as usual approach. And so far the initial results suggest we are able to select using that, looking at that past data, we're able to select a group that is substantially stronger in terms of their past evaluation data, and then we'll be able to track whether that group has better impacts on their teacher candidates.
Well, it's critically important work, and I look forward to hearing more from you all in the future. And Bob and Mike might have some questions, so I will defer to them.
Yeah, I've got a quick. I'm gonna have to jump off here. I've got a 12:15 appointment off site, but let me say this: I used to teach a course in problem solving and decision making, and a large portion of that course was on questioning the void, et cetera. And I'm really very glad to see the emphasis being placed on questioning here, because if you really want to find out what's going on, learning how to ask good questions is the best way to do it. So looks like you're doing a good piece of work, and look forward to seeing more. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree. I think that the more you can, to back on Bob's comments, the more you can develop the science problem solving, not just in education, but throughout all of government. It's a big deal. I'm for it. But this is something we need to really stick with and go with for a good while. Not let go of it, not drop it. Sarah?
We agree with you, Mike.
we very much agree with you there.
I think we all do.
Yep. We, fortunately, the state's been very supportive of continuing to allow me opportunities to work with them. So I know that even though the state's still working on a no-cost extension for the grant that we currently have in place, they've already given me permission to continue to work with them through 2021 to make sure that we at least get through, the analyses that we need to do to make sure that the work is in fact having effects or not, right? We want to know the truth. But of course, I'm committed to continue to, work with the state as long as they're willing to let me.
Well, we're delighted to have you. I was actually just going to compliment you and Michael and Kevin and all the work that you have done across teams. I think we hear a lot about research to practice partnerships, and this is a really effective example of that. Not every state's been able to nail that, and I know it's an iterative process that involves a lot of intense communication, and you guys are doing a really exemplary job.
Thank you. We've had growing pains, but we've made it to a good place.
It sure seems like that. So, Lily and Sarah, do y'all have any final comments before we wrap up this meeting?
I just want to jump in quickly and say I think we had a great discussion today. A lot of important work is happening both in the department with our staff and the work that Dr. Ronfeld is doing. So thank you all so much for great presentations today. Sarah, I think we may want to talk about doing a poll in the future for our next meeting and whether that would be in person or over the phone. We'll look to your all's guidance on how much content we'll have for our next meeting. So we don't want to neglect being able to have in-depth conversations when we really need to have those. So thank you all so much. Sarah?
I would echo everything everyone said. I think that last discussion was really exciting. I'm thrilled to know we're getting so much good data on our clinical mentoring, and I think there's some really promising work there. So look forward to digging in more at a future meeting, and like Lillian said, we'll circle back to determine exactly when that will be, but look forward to it, and thank everybody for their time this morning.
Thanks for joining us, Matt. We appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm excited to say that we are adjourned exactly at 11 a.m. on time. Thank you all so much. Enjoy your holiday.
Well done. Meet the run on time.
Thank you all.